First of all, I want to say thanks to everybody for coming out today. I want to also say thanks to OpenTechSchool for having the conference, OTS Dortmund for hosting us. Thanks to my fellow speakers for having such great talks. Thanks to everybody who's put some time into this. My name is Jennifer Geacone-Cruz. Some of you may know me as Anonymous Editrix on Twitter or GitHub. I'm also the content and media manager for livingstyleguide.org, which is an open source Ruby gem project creating living style guides from Sass and Markdown. We also have a team in Rails Girls Summer of Code, so please check it out. I'm a publishing and product infrastructure designer and a Japanologist based in Berlin. And this is an extension of a series of talks that I gave at Upfront in Berlin last March. And the first part of the talk that I gave, or the first part of the series, was a talk about Japanese front end and Japanese web and the different factors that influence it and what makes it so Japanese. And for a lot of people that don't really have a lot of experience with Japanese web or Japanese tech or had never been there, it can be a bit of a mystery, so I thought that would be a great thing to start to talk about. And one of the sections in my talk touched on Japanese mobile phones, or keitai denwa, and how their growth into a staple of Japanese life in the 1990s and beyond until now shaped the way that Japanese websites and the Japanese web in general were concepted and structured, and ultimately how they've changed or haven't changed, which is something I talked about, in response to the way that people use them. That particular part of my talk got a huge response from a lot of people, and I decided that the second part of my series would be about that, since it seemed to be something people wanted to know more about. And it also was something that really touched for me because before I went to Japan in the early 2000s, I was quite late to the cell phone party. I didn't really have one until I think it was about 2001. And it wasn't something that was really a part of my life. And cell phone culture in the US at the time was quite limited and shallow. You only had a few phones to choose from. You didn't really have any kind of mobile web access. And when I got to Tokyo and I saw the amazing selection of phones and all the different features and an incredible amount of rich culture behind it, I was totally hooked. So this is sort of a tribute to that. So today we're going to talk about the role of the mobile phone in Japan, both the past and the present, and its role culturally and technologically. How development and design technology in regards to mobile web in Japan has shaped the general state of the web and design and dev all over the world, and the current state of mobile web and mobile culture in Japan. And then I'm going to talk about some ideas about where it should or might be headed. So let's get started. Has anybody here ever been to Japan before, just by a show of hands? Okay, a few people. For those of you who haven't been to Japan, can I just get a few shout-outs about what you think of when you think of Japanese mobile phones or Japanese mobile culture? Anybody? Okay. Anything else? Okay, yeah, emojis are one of the biggest exports. And people tend to think of how they use the mobile phones with emojis, or although sometimes I get decora, which are the decorations on the backs of the phones, or all of the little straps and things that come off of it. But I don't really hear so much about how people use their mobile phones, and that's really what's actually very fascinating. This is what one of the early models of Japanese mobile phones looked like. It's a flip phone. It's a keitai denwa. And it's one of the I-mode phones, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in a moment. So this word keitai denwa, or portable phone, these are some selections of phones. These phones are actually probably still available in Japan now. And this is an interesting case because smartphones aren't the only phones. It's really hard to find a non-smartphone or a non-low-level smartphone everywhere else. But here in Japan, a lot of different types of phones are still available. So what about these keitais? Well, to help you better understand exactly where they stand right now, let's take a look at some numbers. Japan has a 95% mobile phone subscription rate. That means roughly 4.8 million subscribers. That's an incredible amount of market penetration. That's 95%. It's rare to see someone who doesn't have a mobile phone. And for people who work in the mobile industry, who work with mobile technology, to have 95% saturation in the market, that's just incredible. To build on that, 79.7% are mobile internet users. Not just that they use apps that use the internet, but that they're actually actively browsing the web using their device. So that's about roughly 107.5 million people. And the number of people who access the web via their mobile phone in Japan is more than twice the number of that in the US. Japan may be small and it's very densely populated, but it's not nearly as big as the US. So that's an incredible number of people. So now that we have a kind of an idea about how densely saturated the market is, let's talk about how that market even started. And we're going to take a quick catch up on our mobile web history. So this is going to help us to understand how pivotal Japan's role in mobile web development is. And we're going to start with 1996 in Finland. Although the first commercially offered mobile web emerged in Finland in 1996, on the Nokia 9000 communicator or the 9110 communicator series in 1997, does anybody remember those? Anyone? If you saw the movie, the terrible movie, The Saint, you'd see Val Kilmer using one in the back of the car, maybe. That's how I remember it, unfortunately. And this was offered by Sonera and Radiolinja networks, and this was the first commercially offered system. But then, there was the mobile web boom in Japan in 1999. And with that came NTT Docomo's pivotal iMode system. NTT Docomo is one of the big 3 mobile providers in Japan. And they came up with a system called iMode. And iMode was a web delivery service for mobiles. It was based on CHTML, compact HTML, if anybody remember that, and also proprietary ALP and TLP protocols. And this was a huge jump forward in customized content. You actually physically had an iMode button on the phone, and you pressed the iMode button, and you would be put into the browser on the screen, much like that. And you would be able to surf the web by using the arrow navigation buttons on the phone. And as you can see here, it was largely navigable by using hypertext links like that. And if you've seen my first talk, I've talked a lot about these blue linking. So this is what it looks like. On the left, we have the iMode menu. And on the right, we have an easy web menu, which was from AUKDDI. And the content is controlled by the provider in this case. The iMode websites or the Easy Web websites are actually delivered to you by the company. And this is great for the companies because they could have a lot of control over the pricing and billing, and they could charge you for incoming and outgoing data packets. So this had a big effect on their business model as well. A lot of the other providers, or the big 3 providers, followed suit soon after that. So you had EasyWeb with AUKDDI, and JSky, which was my first phone in Japan. That was JPhone, and then it became Vodafone, and now it's SoftBank. And this put Japan, and Scandinavia as well, at the forefront of the mobile phone web usage revolution, long before web-ready handsets were available and proliferated in the US and most of Europe, among other places. So this was definitely the boiling point for a lot of stuff that was happening with mobile web in Japan. And this means that with the market traction of accessing the web via mobile phone, there also came an evolution in Japanese front end. And as I said before, I addressed some of these issues like the blue linking and other things there. And we'll also talk about this again in a little bit. So now that this power was put in people's hands, what happens with it? Where did it come from? What became of it? And I think that that lies in things like people, practices, and power. And this comes from a really great piece of research that was done by Wellman and Haythornthwaite in their research body, the Internet of Everyday Life. And they said it really elegantly. The Internet is not a system floating ethereally above societies. It is embedded in the concrete realities of people, practices, and power. This is true of mobile web. This is true of any kind of web. And I really think it's a beautiful quote because it is really bringing together that whole pyramid of usage. And this is definitely applicable to Japanese web. In terms of people, these people are a really interesting age demographic. The average user of a mobile web device in 2000 was between 20 and 29 years of age. And it breaks down to about roughly half and half. I mean, we're missing some data there. And it skewed slightly older in 2011 as we went on in years, which I think is actually quite predictable. I don't think it really means anything in terms of the people that are using it, but rather it's more an actual function of the population decline and the lack of new babies being born in Japan, lack of younger people. But what it also proves is that there is a very fast adoption rate in Japan when it comes to new devices. And that means that there's a quick market saturation. And that's really important because that means that companies had to come up with new devices, new ways of accessing the web, new schemes of delivering the web, new ways to keep the user engaged. So yeah, in some ways it's skewed older, in some ways it's skewed younger. It's probably skewed older because as early adopters age and the elderly are also getting involved in this game. They're using phones that are specially marketed to them, and that's also a function of adoption and saturation. And some other ways it's skewed younger. Again, because Japan's population is declining, there's a lot of market scrabbling to try and get all of those youngsters to come and use your company's phone or your company's system. And what I found was interesting is that the fastest growing subset of mobile web users in Japan is aged 5 years old or less. That's pretty crazy considering that very few babies are being born there right now. But then again, it also shows you that the content is being marketed to children, which is in some ways great and in some ways a little bit scary. So how are these people using it? How are they applying it in practice? Well, before the advent of smartphones, people were either using low-end PHS phones or feature phones, also known as garake. This comes from the idea of going back to Darwinism, that in the Galapagos Islands, animals were adapted to their environment through evolution, and so they had special functions that were only usable in their immediate environment. And much like, let's say, finches in the Galapagos Island, Japanese mobile phones are only usable immediately in the Japanese environment. They had features that were only really useful for Japanese users, which is hence why they're called garake or Galapagos keitai. And these are completely market specific. And at the start of the mobile web, the keitai were often the sole means for everyday internet access, which is kind of interesting because we have this idea that Japan is so interconnected to the web and everybody's got internet everywhere all the time and it's super fast, even back in the 90s, which isn't true. Actually, to get an at-home internet connection, it was still kind of a slow development for that. They were still really rare in the 90s, and most people had access to the internet only at work or at school. So if they wanted some kind of access to the internet outside of those spheres, they had to use their phone. So talking about their daily mobile web access, after the debut of iMode in 1999, by May 2001, more than 40 million Japanese were accessing their internet via their mobile phones on a daily basis. Their North American counterparts, only 4 million at that time. This number nearly doubled in slightly less than 2 years later because of Japanese Ministry of Telecommunications tried to push a lot of these business initiatives for the mobile companies. And this really gave them a lot of subsidies to make new innovations, and a lot of these new innovations had some lasting impact. A lot of them had to do with technical delivery systems. A lot of them had to do with actually coming up with new technology that sometimes we find now surviving still in our smartphones. A lot of these practices that have come out of that are things now like mobile phone payment systems, like Felica. We don't have them so much here in Europe, but in Japan they're a huge innovation. People can just lay their smartphone down on the reader. It's starting to become more popular here now with SmartPay. QR codes, that's something we use every day. That was an outgrowth of this. We have the Mail magazine, which is a proto-blog that was popular in the 90s and 2000s. That's now grown into regular amounts of microblogging. And also, Japan had streaming video and TV on their mobile phones. Not necessarily on the flip phones, but on some of the later model pre-smartphone flip phones, you actually had an antenna and you could watch TV. And I had one and it was pretty cool. So a lot of these innovations have had some lasting impact and are still visible in a lot of the things that we actually use every day now on our smartphones, just in a slightly different mode of accessing the web. So how did all of these innovations give us power? What kind of power did we get out of it? Well, we don't necessarily look at it in terms of business because we're the end users, so we see our power in terms of how much freedom we can have to use the data to get TV or to look at that blog. But for the companies, iMode business model is the basis of the current mobile business model. So this idea that you are going to pay for flat rate packets of data, that comes from iMode. That wasn't really a thing before. There was a big emphasis on development, developing new business models, developing new technical capabilities, developing new ways to get a faster, better, more reliable network. And it also set the stage for later app-centered technologies. So this is one of the biggest legacies of Japanese mobile web, is in the infrastructure that we have now for both business and technological advancements in mobile web. There's some pros that come with that. That means now we live in a society where we have mobile first. So mobile first was first in Japan. And now we are living in a world where mobile first is pretty much more or less the mantra everywhere. The mobile web proliferated a lot faster than it probably would have otherwise because there was such a huge push to really pull things through in a new, faster evolution. And it also set the pace and direction for tech and business models, like you've seen there. There's a really interesting thing that I'm going to get to in a minute that's about the iPhone and Android, which is kind of an outset of the direction of tech and business models. But there are also some cons. That also meant that Japanese web is biased towards text and blue links because that's what was visible on these garake. And they're still in use today, and a lot of people still use them now. And this is something that kind of holds Japanese web development back a little bit. That also means you've got a lot of dead sites. There's a lot of sites that are just there and they are static, they don't change very much because that also causes problems with breaking a lot of the links for those blue linked websites. And it means also there's a legacy of flash and image mapping, which worked really well on these kind of early web access, but they didn't work very well later on with things like smartphones. And we're still in these kind of painful stages of trying to wean off of that. And hopefully that'll get better, but there's also the problem that a lot of these things are problems that we experienced using smartphones. And smartphones seem to be the future now. So, what can we say about that? Well, smartphones are kind of slow to proliferate in Japan. You'd think they would be kind of quick to get there, but they're not quite. They call smartphones smafo. So people adopt them quickly, but they're not really spreading very fast. People are still using Geacone. In 2014, the fastest growing subset of mobile web users was less than 5%, right? So less than 5 years old. And this means that they're using smartphones. They're not using these old flip phones or a lot of these old Geacone because it's easy for them to touch, it's easy for them to interact with the apps. And this also has to do with proliferation of apps. But it also means that Geacone still have a place for people like the elderly who need big buttons, user visibility. So they're able to somehow coexist. Then there's this idea of the business models, which I'm talked about. In this case, it's iPhone versus Android. So this is the kind of fun fact. The iPhone was a bit slow to catch on in Japan because of the carrier choice. It wasn't available in Japan until about mid-2008. And SoftBank had a 3-year lock on the iPhone and iPad retail. And the contracts with them, because number portability wasn't a thing in Japan then. And people didn't really like that because they wanted to keep their phone number if they were going to switch to SoftBank just to be able to get an iPhone. So until then, iPhone had a lock on the market until very, very recently because people had to choose it and stick with it. But now, in fact, Japan is the only market where Android is actually getting a gain by nearly 8 percentage points, because now that there's number portability in Japan, people are switching to Android, especially in the last 2 years. And that's with some data that we got from the Kantar World Panel. So it's kind of interesting to see how things are changing now that some more rigid rules about mobile web in Japan are changing, like number portability or being able to change your provider rather easily. So what about the future? Well, I think that what will happen is now that things are changing a little bit more, web developers are going to make better mobile-friendly sites. I've seen some big differences. Some people have said to me, well, you know, you gave that talk a year ago, and I've seen some really great sites since then, but I think it's also that a lot of people are really trying to focus on the proliferation of smartphones. And that's changing the way that they're looking at what kind of mobile first they're using. It's also probably going to improve existing issues in web design as it affects desktop-oriented sites. There's a big disconnect between, say, the Western world where we're focusing on mobile first, and in Japan where now there's a bit of a situation where it's been desktop first for about 10 years or so. And I think that that'll start to normalize a little bit more. But it also means that there's a lot of compartmentalization between the two. There's a lot of homogeneity and muting of the market because now there's really just smartphones. And that means that it's more app-oriented and it's less web-oriented. So there's not maybe a whole lot that's going to change about how people are using the web in Japan unless it's related to how the web is used in apps. So what are some takeaways that you can have from this? Well, early mobile web adoption drove Japanese web design priorities. And because of that, they were able to develop a really usable early mobile web that people were accessing on a daily basis when other access forms of the internet were not available. The mobile web also drove new innovation. And we saw that in QR codes and other types of things that now we sort of kind of take for granted. The smartphone proliferation has muted the market. And I think this is the kind of saddest thing because I think Geacone are quite interesting. They have some cool features. And it's kind of the thing that everybody says, ooh, this is a Japanese phone. So hopefully we can somehow find a medium because I think there was a lot of creativity and product development when it came to Geacone. And I think maybe that won't change because there's still enough people in Japan that are using the old style phones that there's still kind of a cult following for that. So I'm hoping that that'll stick around at least a little bit longer. And I think front-end priorities are going to change as a result, not only because we live in a mobile-first world, but also we have more ways to access the web. So it's not just about like, okay, well, we have desktops covered, now let's focus on mobile. Well, now mobile is pretty much on the same level as desktop, so it can be more about like, okay, well, now that we've got it covered, let's try to do something new with it. So yeah, when you think about the way that you use the web on your smartphone now or the phone that you had even 10 years ago, you have a lot to think about when it comes to how Japanese mobile culture brought that to you. And I hope that maybe you can see the way that you use the internet on your phone in a new way now. So yeah, thank you.